Well, hello and welcome to the Ask Me Anything About Empower live webinar. I'm Neil Lander from Waters. Welcome to our quarterly webinar. Today's topic will be on sample sets, sample set methods, and sample set method templates. So first off, just a couple of housekeeping and introductory notes before we get into the topic. We did get quite a few questions that were submitted during the registration process. So first of all, thank you very much. There were some questions that were not related to today's topic, but that's quite all right. I will go through all of the questions, and since we have email addresses, I can answer individually. This way, all the different questions do get addressed, as there were a variety of different topics in those questions. So that was good. Thank you very much. And also, I should say thank you for taking the time to joining us today, especially during this challenging time that we're all going through. I think using these webinars is a great way to communicate and to stay in touch. So, I selected some of the questions from the registration process, and I'm going to go through those questions first. We'll then go live into Empower and take live questions, and I'll answer those, and then we'll have a summary and a wrap-up at the end. So please use the question and answer feature to submit the questions during the webinar. We'll get to as many of the questions as possible during the time that we have. And then you'll also receive an email after this webinar with the recording, the slides, and again with the questions that we don't get to during the time that we have. I'll reach out to each person individually that submitted a question and do my best to answer. I should also say that if there are any issues, you can use the Q&A function to send us questions, and my colleague will send me a message if there are any technical issues during the webinar. So just a little bit about myself. I joined Waters in 1994, and I was in field technical support here in the United States. I then joined the customer education department after a few years and worked to create and deliver customer training for first our Millennium software and then Empower software following that. And in the last 5+ years, I've been involved in the informatics department, working on support both internally and externally for Empower software and helping customers achieve their success and goals in working with Empower software. Before we get to the question, I also want to add, and I will remind you at the end of the webinar, that we do have the Empower blog that I have been running now for over 3 years. Thank you to everyone that's following that blog, and thank you to everyone who has been submitting questions to the blog. That's great. And I'll remind you of this at the end, and I'll show you the URL to get to the blog and also the fact that you can subscribe. So we'll talk about that at the very end. Let's now start with the first question that I selected from the questions we received during the registration process. Can you please define the terms and give an overview of the differences between sample set method, and sample set method template? The terms all sound very similar. And I agree, they do sound very similar, but let's see if we can sort out what the differences are between these things. So a sample set is a bound collection of raw data. This is the data that we actually collect. Now, how do we get a sample set? We can use either a sample set method or a sample set method to generate data. And let's look at the definitions for these. A sample set method is a method which describes what samples you're going to run and how. So what do we mean by that? We're thinking about the order in which we will have the samples injected. How many injections of each? What is the injection volume? And so forth and so on. So we're defining the samples that we're going to run and how we're going to run them. That's a sample set method. And I use the word run. So when we have a sample set method and we run that method, we generate a sample set, which is a bound collection of raw data. I say that because that collection of data has a relationship. Perhaps I've run some standards and I've run some samples and I've run my system suitability check first. All of that is related. A sample set method template is a type of sample set method with one additional feature in that we can use sample set method templates to prompt us for things that change on a routine basis. So if you imagine doing a routine test where you have one or two or maybe more variables from day to day, like the number of samples, we can use the template to prompt us to plug in that variable, and everything else stays the same. So our standards and standard bracketing and system suitability and all of that remains consistent, but perhaps the number of samples that we have in the laboratory each day varies. So the template can prompt us to plug in that number, and then everything else would be the same from day to day. Here, I'll show you some screenshots. So sample set, again, that's raw data. That can be found on the Sample Sets tab in the project window. And once you have a sample set, you can right-click and go to Alter Sample to view the information related to the samples. So this is the data that has already been collected. Here we see a sample set method. And in the sample set method, we have defined a number of things. We can see we have an equilibrate line at the beginning. We have the injection of the system suitability sample. And then we have, pardon me, in this case, the summarized custom fields, which could be used if I am trying to calculate the %RSD of area from my replicate injections of the syssuit sample. And then we have standard, samples, and another standard, so we're bracketing standards around the group of samples. Each row, as you can see, has the injection volume, the number of injections, whether it's a standard or a sample, what method set is being used, and then how the processing should be handled. So this is a sample set method. It would be found on the Methods tab in the project, and it is something that can be used many times. It can be modified and so forth. It can be locked. So just like any other method in Empower, it behaves in the same fashion. Now, a sample set method template, as I mentioned before, this is a type of sample set method with a little bit of an additional feature in that I'm in a routine environment. I need to keep everything consistent. My bracketed standards, my system suitability, whatever it happens to be that I do for the routine tests that I run from day to day. But there might be some variables, depending on how many samples I find in the lab in the morning when I come in or on my shift. I need to adjust for that number of samples. So in this case, in the screen, it's prompting me for the number of sample vials. There could be other things. There could be the sample name or other sample custom fields that I might have that vary on a routine basis. So I would be prompted to enter those pieces of information, but everything else that's built into the method would remain consistent. So this is great for a QC environment where we're doing repetitive testing. So I hope that answers the question about the differences between the sample set, which is data, the sample set method, and the sample set method template, which are methods and can be found on the Methods tab of the project. So a contemporary topic that we have and that we've been talking about is method lifecycle management, or MLCM. And there was a question that was submitted that reads, how can sample set method templates be used to implement method lifecycle management approaches? So with method lifecycle management, we may be monitoring the performance of the method over time. There are different stages of method lifecycle management, and in one area we look at the performance of the method over time, and we monitor key parameters. And the sample set method template could help in this effort. So the sample set method template, as we talked about before, is a sample set method, can be used to prompt you for certain key variables on a routine basis. And it's a great control strategy to ensure that your standard curve that you generate from your standards, that the bracketing of the standards, where they're located in relationship to the samples, are consistent, and also to contain any custom fields. There may be sample custom fields that are necessary to identify our samples. Perhaps some of those sample custom fields then get incorporated into a custom peak field for calculations. So we ensure that the placement of the standards, the generation of the calibration curve, and any custom field information is there and is there in a consistent fashion. So this could potentially reduce any system suitability deviations caused by putting in incorrect values or placing standards in the wrong spot in the queue, or not having the right information from the samples to make the calculations. So this can be a very good tool as a control strategy to ensure that these things take place in a consistent fashion so that over time we can indeed look at the performance of our chromatographic method. So, great question. Thanks. I appreciate that. Here's another very good question. I would like to hear about calculations that can be put into sample set methods without the use of custom fields. I know there are certain fields which numbers are multiplied or divided by, for example. Okay. So let's take a look. And I'm going to show you a screen capture in just a moment. But there are a number of fields, such as sample weight, dilution, blank subtraction, a number of fields that do play a role in certain calculations that do not involve custom fields. So let me just show you a screen capture. Hopefully you can see this. So since the person asking the question mentioned the sample weight and the dilution, sample weights and dilutions do behave differently, standards versus samples. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I look at a sample, when I run a sample, and I am quantitating my API off of the calibration curve, what happens is Empower takes that amount or concentration from the calibration curve. It then divides it by the sample weight and multiplies it by the dilution factor, and that's the final number that Empower reports. Now, the defaults for these fields are 1. So essentially, the value read from the calibration curve versus the final value that Empower reports would be exactly the same. But if I did need in my assay to take that number, divide it by the sample weight times the dilution factor, I can take advantage of those fields. For a standard, it works the other way around. It would take the amount and multiply it by the sample weight and divide it by the dilution factor. So it works differently whether you're looking at a standard versus a sample. Then we have the field that says blank. So if we were going to calculate signal to noise and use the noise from a blank injection, which is the recommended way to calculate signal to noise according to the USP, we would need to indicate in the Q which is the blank. So any sample that follows that blank row would use the noise calculated from that blank in the signal-to-noise calculation. So that's a checkbox. We also have peak ratio reference. That's another checkbox. So we can, and I know primarily people use it with mass spec, but you can use it with any type of detection, chromatographic detection, even just straightforward UV. It works nicely. If we take the ratio of the response of the analyte in a standard where we know what the compound is, and then we see a peak in a sample chromatogram with a similar ratio, we come to the conclusion that that's probably the same compound. And in the processing method, you can set a tolerance based on the reference standard. So if you want to take advantage of that, again, you would have to check the box to indicate which one in the Q is the reference standard. So if the ratio is 20 to 1, and we can set a 10% plus minus on that, then you have to indicate which one is the reference. It compares it to the reference, and if it's within the tolerance, great. If it's outside of it, it would be a faulted result. Those values appear in red. You also have targeted masses that you see there. And so those can be used with or without the mass calculator that's in the run samples window. But this would be if I was doing injection-based expected mass processing. So I plug the values in here to the sample set method, and after the sample is injected, Empower goes and looks to see if those masses are found in that sample. So, and there are some other things in here as well, having to do with dissolution and so forth and so on. So that's a great question. There are a number of fields in the sample set method that either result in or have an effect on calculations that Empower makes independently of any custom fields. So thank you very much for that very good question. Here's another question. What is a process-only sample set? And this was introduced, I think, in Base Empower 3 back in 2010. And essentially, I have some information here on the screen, but let me summarize what a process-only sample set is. It's a sample set that can consist of injections or channels from different sample sets put together in one set for processing purposes. So, for example, let's say that I ran my standards in sample set 1 and my samples in sample set 2, and I wanted to combine them into one sample set so that when I process that sample set, I get one result set. So I can create a process-only sample set by either combining sample sets, injections, or channels. So just a screen capture here. Here I'm on the injections tab of a project. You can see that the upper group that's highlighted, those first 5, come from one sample set, and the lower lower 5 come from another sample set. And so I've highlighted them, and then I can right-click, create process-only sample set. It will ask me a few questions. For example, if I have multiple injections, as you can, let's see, in this case, there are multiple injections for some of the rows. It'll ask you if you want to split them out or combine them. And then once you do that, it looks like the alter sample window. So you can add in your information, save your changes, and process as one sample set. Now, Empower will distinguish the process-only sample set from an acquired sample set. So if you go into the sample set tab of the project, you can make a view filter that includes a field called sample set type. And that sample set type will say if it's process only or acquired. Acquired would be the typical sample set. Process only would be the process only sample sets. So it is a function, again, that allows you to take sample sets, channels, injections, and combine them into one set so that you can process and get one result set. So thank you very much. That's a good question, and it's a good function to know about in Empower. All right, so I am going to share my screen so that we can see Empower. And then I have questions that have been coming in as I've been talking. So I'm going to begin to address some of those questions. All right, so bear with me. Again, my colleague is monitoring, so if there is any problem and the screen is not showing up, she will send me a text. So eventually, and hopefully, you will see a project window. And again, as I'm chatting with you, I am receiving questions, and I'm going to take this question first. How do I set up my sample set method to use interactive systems?
Okay, hello. I hope that you can hear me now. Please, I'm asking my colleague to just confirm that you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay. What was the last thing I said? I'm sorry.
I believe you were on your second question of the demo.
The live demo?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So my apologies. We had an audio problem, so let's continue. And let me go to my Empower screen. And first of all, let's restate the question due to that interruption. My apologies. The question was, how do I set up my sample set method to use interactive system suitability? So first of all, what is interactive system suitability? Well, we could even ask, what is system suitability? But system suitability is something we do at the beginning of each day to ensure that our method and our chromatographic system are working properly. Once we do that, then we can move on to injecting our standards and our samples and getting our work done. So we want to make sure that the method and the system is working properly before we proceed. Interactive system suitability is a way of having Empower evaluate the system suitability, and if everything is good, it would continue on to inject your standards and samples. But if the system suitability fails, it would stop the instrument from injecting. So how do we set that up? And what would trigger interactive system suitability? And I've been getting this question a lot lately. I just returned from a trip where I visited a number of customers, and everybody was asking about it. So it seems to be a very hot topic at the moment. Well, the way we trigger interactive system suitability and the way it would stop the instrument from running is if we generate a processing fault. So, for example, if I go into a processing method and I went to the Components tab, and I know there may be a little delay in how the screens change, so I won't click too quickly through the screens here. Let's say that I went in and I had an internal standard peak. If Empower were to process a channel of data and that internal standard peak was missing, that would generate a processing fault. Or perhaps I have a must peak. It's a peak that must be there in every single chromatogram. Again, if something like that were missing, it would trigger a processing fault, which would then trigger interactive system suitability. It could also be something that we've set a limit for. So if I'm using system suitability, I've got my system suitability turned on in the processing method so that I have plate count and tailing factor and resolution calculated. I might also decide to set up some limits for various fields that I'm looking at. So for example, perhaps for this first peak, I am going to track the USP plate count. So I can locate the USP plate count in the suitability limits table, and then I can put in a lower error limit in this case. Let's say that the plate count needs to be no lower than 5,000. Again, I make an injection. The plate count for the peak is below 5,000. That would be a faulted result, and that would trigger interactive system suitability. So these are some examples of how in the processing method we can set up certain parameters around which the system suitability samples must meet those criteria. Now, there's another thing that we can consider as well. If I am making replicate injections of my system suitability sample and calculating % RSDs on area or retention time, there I might have an intersample custom summary field, and I can use that as my criteria as well. So if I go into run samples, let's take a look at the possibilities that we have. So up at the top, we have run only, and the choices there are, as you know, run only, run in process, run in report. And right next to it is interactive system suitability settings. Now, the default is to continue on fault, meaning if there is a fault, just continue on to the next line and keep injecting. But if I switch it to stop on fault, what would happen? So let's just say that our first sample was the system suitability sample, and I'm going to make 6 injections, and so I'm just going to put in syssuit for a name, put in a method set, and then I have normal processing. There's one of 2 ways that we can handle this. I'm going to make the next line summarize custom field, because let's say that I did have that %RSD on the area from the 6 replicate injections. And then after that, now I have all of my standards and samples. Okay? So we've got a bunch of samples like this. I'm going to set this to don't process or report. Okay, so now there's 1 or 2 ways that we can do this. If we are indeed going to generate results for the system suitability samples, then in the method set, we have to have the processing method. And there are 2 ways to look at this. One way is we could be in the run and process mode, and we only have normal processing for our system suitability sample. The rest of the samples don't process and report. Why? Because most people want to collect the sample set, look at the data, and then generate the results for the samples post-run. So the only thing we want Empower to generate results for would be for the system suitability injection. So I'm in run and process mode. I have the interactive syssuit set to stop on fault. I can go in the processing method, and I can use the limits tab that I just showed you a moment ago to set a limit for the %RSD of the area. That would be a custom field that I create. And I can say that the upper error limit is 2%. So now Empower makes the injections, calculates the results. The summarized custom fields tells it to calculate the %RSD on the area. And if that %RSD on area was 1.5, well, that's good. Then it would go on. It would start injecting the various lines in the queue. But if that %RSD turned out to be 2.1%, that exceeds the limit, it would stop on fault. So that's one way of handling interactive system suitability. In Empower 3 Feature Release 2, which was introduced in 2013, we introduced a new system policy that allows you to do interactive system suitability in the run-only mode. Now, what is the advantage of doing it this way? And I've had a lot of discussions about this just recently. Well, first of all, you still need to have a method set with a processing method, and you still want to have normal processing for your system suitability samples. So what happens in this case is, because I'm in the run-only mode and I have this new system policy selected, when Empower generates the results for the system suitability sample and they pass, it doesn't save those results. Once the sample set is complete, you go back and process the sample set, and you have one result set. The issue with doing it in the run and process mode was you generate 2 sets of results. One set of results for the system suitability samples, and then one overall result set for the whole sample set. And there was some concern that we were generating two result sets for one sample set. By using this new feature in the run-only mode, if the SysSuit samples pass, no results are generated. Once the sample set is complete, you can process the sample set and get one result set. Now, on the other hand, if the system suitability samples fail, it would still trigger the stop on false, and then you need to go and investigate why you have a system suitability failure. So these are the possibilities that you have if you're on older versions of Empower. In other words, before Feature Release 2, then you would do the run and process. If you're on Feature Release 2 or newer, you could take advantage of the run-only mode, but you would have to enable that system policy. Now, related to this, and again, I've had a lot of questions about this recently, what about the pump? Somebody asked more than once. I've had the question, now my pump is pumping at the analytical flow rate. I'm wasting mobile phase while I'm trying to determine what's wrong with SysSuit and make corrections. Well, you could in the instrument method. And I'm going to, again, try not to click around too quickly here because there's a slight delay between my clicking and what you see. But if I go on the flow tab for the pump, whether it's an Alliance or an Acuity, the Waters pumps behave in a similar fashion. If I create a gradient table, even if I'm doing an isocratic method, this will work in the same fashion. You know, here's my 60/40 A and B, which is aqueous and organic. And maybe after 5 minutes, I go up to 20/80. And then after a few minutes, I bring the pump back down to its original conditions. This is what I run for my sample. And maybe I hold it for a couple of minutes just to re-equilibrate the column. So here I have my gradient. I make an injection. The injection has a run time. And when an injection begins, then there's a clock in run samples that counts from 0 to the runtime. And every time the system makes an injection, it triggers that clock, and it goes back to 0 and starts over again. But after the last injection, there's nothing to trigger the clock. So if I'm at the end of the sample set, or if I'm stopped on fault because of a SysSuit failure, there's nothing to trigger the clock. The clock keeps recording time. So what I can do is I can put one additional line in my instrument method for the pump, and I can say at 30 minutes, lower the pump flow rate to 1/10 of a mil per minute using curve 11. What curve 11 tells Empower to do is, or what Empower tells the pump to do at that point is, only make that change at the end of the time segment. So every 10 minutes I'm making an injection, clock gets re-zeroed, but because I'm stopped on fault due to a SysSuit failure, there's nothing that can trigger that clock. It doesn't re-zero. It keeps recording time. When it hits 30 minutes, and only when it hits 30 minutes, it would then lower the pump flow rate down to 0.1 or 0, but I would be careful about that if you're using any buffers. So a rather long answer to, I think, what is a fairly important question about interactive system suitability. Here's another question that came in, and actually there are more than one related to this particular topic. So let me go back to my Run Samples window, and let me do something here. I'm going to load in a sample set method that I created. Okay. The question has to do with the label column, the labeled reference column, and also the processing column. And I'm just going to paraphrase the question because it came in a few times with just slightly different wording. But essentially, what is the purpose of these fields and how do they work? So in this case, I have bracketed standards. So I have a standard here, samples, another standard, and then I use these two standards to generate a calibration curve and then quantitate the samples in between. Then I have another group of samples, another standard, and then I take that standard and that standard, make a new calibration curve, and quantitate these samples in between. So, in order to make this work properly, we use the labels, the label reference field, and the processing field. So you can see here, now, these labels, if you use the sample set method wizard to create the sample set method, Empower will automatically populate this field with labels. Any standard will have the label beginning with the letter S. Any sample will have a label beginning with the letter U. Any control samples would begin with the letter C. You do not have to use these labels. You can put your own labels in if you want. That's certainly possible. So you can see here, this standard has a label of S0101. That standard has a label of S0201. We have a clear calibration line, calibrate, and quantitate. So what is it going to generate the calibration curve from? The standards that begin with the label S01 and S02. So the label reference is telling Empower, go back in the table, find these two standards with these labels, and use those standards to generate the calibration curve. Quantitate, anything with label U01. So it goes back, again, anything that begins with U01. We have 5 samples that begin with that label. And then it would go and it would quantitate those samples and use that calibration curve it just generated. So again, next 5 samples, they all begin with U02, and the third standard begins with S03. Clear calibration, calibrate. Calibrate with what? S02, which is here, and S03, which is here. Quantitate U02, and these 5 have the U02 label. So when I'm doing bracketing of standards around my samples, it's a way of indicating which standards should be used to generate the calibration curve and which samples will then be quantitated against that curve. We have other functions, such as the report function. And you can see here I've got the last line set to report with the name of the summary report, and the label reference is SS. And that would be for my system suitability sample. Pardon me. So it knows to go back and grab those samples with that label, and in this case, prepare a summary report summarizing the system suitability samples. So that's a great question. Not everybody uses the labels and the label reference, but that's how they work. Okay. Another question that has come in has to do with the sample set method history table. So let's take a look at that. If I go over to the methods, and let me scroll down, we can see, and actually, here are some sample set methods. And you can see that this first one has 2 versions. So this will help us in answering this particular question. If I right-click on that sample set method, and I go to method properties, here I have the method history table. which I believe is what the question is asking. And here we can see that we have two versions of the method. Version 1, who modified the method, whether or not it's locked, the ID numbers, and the version numbers. Now, there's more that you can do in here. For example, if we wanted to know what the difference was between the two versions, you could highlight and click Differences. And now we can see the difference between version 1 and version 2. Version 1 did not have the report function for the system suitability sample. Version 2 does. So it's got the label, the function, the particular report method that's being used, and so forth. So I can see the differences between two versions of this particular method. Now, I can also lock the method from here, assuming I have the privilege to do so. I could come in and I could lock the method. And if I have the appropriate privilege, I could also unlock the method, all from this Method Properties dialog box. So I hope that answers the question about the sample set method history table. Another question that has come in, which I've had multiple times as well, is back here in the sample set method, in the function column, a question came in about the difference between inject standards and inject samples. So when we set up the sample set method, we choose the function to inject standards. We intend to use that standard to generate a response factor and generate a calibration curve. When we say inject samples, we intend to then quantitate that sample based on the response factor that we generate, the calibration curve that we generate. We also have inject controls. And inject controls you can think of as a check sample or a check standard. The control would have a known amount of analyte, and when Empower generates the results for the control sample, it treats it as a regular sample. So it looks at the response of the analyte in the control, compares it to the calibration curve, calculates an amount or a concentration of that analyte, but then it calculates a percent deviation between the calculated amount versus the theoretical amount. There was also a question related to this, in that if I make a mistake and I label something as a standard when it should have been a sample, or vice versa, we can, in Alter Sample, so I'm going to the Sample Sets tab in the project window, and I right-click, and I go to Alter Sample. We cannot change the function post-run, but we could change the sample type post-run. So if this was supposed to be a sample and I've labeled it a standard, I do have the ability to come in and I can change it to an unknown. And if I save that, then Empower will track that in the sample history. So I right-click, View Sample History, and it has tracked the fact that I've made that change. There are actually all kinds of changes here, but you can see here's the date and timestamp. It changed it from a standard to an unknown. And then I could quantitate that against the calibration curve. There are a variety of other functions here in the sample set method. And just yesterday, somebody asked me a slightly different question. And if you take a look in the list of possible functions that we have, in addition to injecting different types of samples and standards. And you can see there are things, depending on the type of work that you're doing. If you're doing GPC or SEC, you'll have inject narrow standard, inject broad standard, and so forth and so on. But you also have things like purging the auto sampler, purging a detector. So if I had a refractive index detector, I could set it up to purge the reference cell in the detector. Wet priming, conditioning column, summarize custom fields I touched on briefly before. That's used if you have an inter-sample summary field, like a percent RSD of area of injection. We need to have that to generate the results for that custom field. So there are a variety of different types of functions. And just yesterday, a question came up about purging the detector. So I thought I would mention that. Let's see, we still have a little bit of time left here. There was a question about using sample set methods for method development. Yes, you certainly could. Now, in this case, I set this up in more of a routine way where I have the same method set, same instrument method over and over again because this is a routine assay that I'm following. There is nothing preventing you from creating multiple method sets and then having a line to equilibrate with the first method set, which would contain the first instrument method, make the injection of the sample. Then the next line would be equilibrate with method set 2 containing instrument method 2. And then the next line would be equilibrate with method set 3 and instrument method 3, and so forth and so on. So we can use the sample set method to generate results from injecting the same sample under different sets of chromatographic conditions. So it's an efficient way of accomplishing method development, especially if you're doing a screening. You put it together in a sample set method with all the method sets, each one containing a different instrument method. Just be sure to put an equilibrate line in between each to re-equilibrate the column with a new set of conditions before you proceed to make the injection. So that's a great question. Thank you very much for that. And I think now, based on the time, I'm going to stop sharing my Empower screen. And we will go back to our slides. And I do want to make a few closing comments here. Just bear with me for a moment. Okay. There we are. So, as mentioned at the beginning of the webcast, my Empower Tip of the Week blog can be found at www.waters.com/Empower Tips. And that's one word. We've been running the blog now for over 3 years. It started in January of 2017. And there are a variety of different topics that can be found at the blog, things such as peak purity, calculating impurities, custom fields, report methods, and so forth and so on. And you can subscribe to the blog. The advantage to subscribing to the blog is that every Thursday you'll get an email with the new tip, the complete tip with all the screens and all the instructions on how to do the particular thing that I'm talking about, and you don't need to go back to the URL. So that's the advantage to subscribing to the blog. This blog has been set up so that we can have a conversation about Empower. I've had a lot of emails from a lot of customers based on the blog, and I enjoy the communication, so please continue to submit questions through the blog. We also have the Waters knowledge base, and that can be found at support.waters.com. And if you use that knowledge base, you search on a topic, and you can also search for the different tips. They are there in the knowledge base as well. So that's at support.waters.com. So we have just a little bit of time left. My apologies again for the audio problem earlier. I had a problem with the phone that I was using, so my apologies for that. I thank you for attending. I wish everyone good luck in these challenging times. We will do another Ask Me Anything About Empower sometime in the next quarter, as we do schedule these quarterly. So please stay tuned, as we'll have an announcement for the date and time of subject of the next Ask Me Anything About Empower webinar. Thank you so much, and all the best.